Hello, beautiful community. I'm doing an innovation of genius because I'm actually semi-lying down, but it looks like I'm sitting up as I am on this delimiting and violent microvascular damage ride. We are talking about the latest leader of the Conservative Party in the UK, but in a way that applies to all of us wherever we are in the world. Canada, Germany, it doesn't matter. We're going to make this conversation importantly translatable. I'm going to do 6 tests, 6 questions that we apply to any right-wing politician approaching power. Depending on the answers, we can say if they're constructive or destructive. Now, don't worry, I will do something similar for centrist and left-leaning politicians too, and for climate politicians too. But this is going to be a litmus test when we worry about the right. And after the litmus test, which I have indeed written out, we'll have just a quick, very free-for-all chat about this particular politician in the UK, because this is not just UK navel gazing. I'm sitting on this tiny island and it's my home. It's actually because she is a politician of the future. Whether that means something good or bad is a separate question, but she's a politician of the kind that we're going to see a lot of. There's going to be many Kemi replicas all over the West, increasingly. And that's why understanding her is actually really useful. Now, the litmus test for a right-wing politician. Is she offering conservative renewal or ex-conservatism? And if you follow me, you know what I'm talking about. So ex-conservatives are politicians who are still wearing conservative clothes, but who have given up on the age-old conservative commitment to checks and balances in democratic institutions. So that's to say they've either become authoritarian populists who want to break the democratic game, or they're political entrepreneurs, not out to break the democratic game, but they're out to surf the waves of public opinion. And if that means damaging the institutions, screw it, so be it. This is about authenticity and self-elevation. Now, a recent case study that's quite useful if you have more time than perhaps realistically you actually do on your hands. And that is Ezra Klein's interview with Vivek Ramaswamy, because it's a very good case study which you can watch and keep asking yourself, is Vivek offering any kind of intellectual renewal of conservatism, or is he offering some intellectual items sellotaped together with sticky tape that really constitute as much rhetorical gas aimed to self-elevate a politician as any kind of constructive renewal of conservative ideology. 2, can this politician reconcile populism and constitutionalism? Now, populism is talked about sloppily. My central view of what it is that it's a way of engaging in political discourse that bridges political discourse with kitchen table talk. Now, that means that populism in of itself is neither good nor bad. The trouble, however, is that it's difficult to keep kitchen table talk responsible, but an increase in kitchen table talk is necessary in modern politics because the general ways a modern state justifies itself to itself, that we were floating about in the 90s, no longer works. It sounds like a kind of bureaucratically alienating discourse. And so engaging in a justifying policy like we're used to in the 90s, even if it would have been reasonable then, now just undermines trust, right? So sort of technocratic centrist lingo in itself is undermining of trust these days. So it's very difficult with populism. There are no easy solutions. And so it's neither good nor bad in principle, but in practice, it's going to be mostly bad, but also necessary. So that's the bind that we're in. Is she a post-truth populist or a political entrepreneur? Or neither? That's the third question. Now, a post-truth populist isn't the same as a political entrepreneur. We've talked about this many times. A political entrepreneur is somebody who rides the waves of political moment for self-advancement and then justifies this way of exploiting politics for gain by talking about self-realization and authenticity and so on, and forgetting the public good. While and that doesn't have to be destructive of institutions. It's sort of just lazy about institutions. It's an approach to politics that may damage institutions as a byproduct because you don't care about anything except yourself. And that is an absolute epidemic in modern politics at the moment. We're seeing, I mean, we're at risk of a situation by the 2030s where most of our politicians are like that. The post-truth populist is worse. They are out to break the democratic game because they're not just liars. They break the very distinction we need to keep making between truth and falsehood. So it's not just that they lie, it's that they no longer care to lie consistently. And that is inherently undermining of democratic norms, right? Was Barack Obama traveling in China in August 2014, or was he not, right? A liar politician would say that he was when he wasn't. A post-truth politician would say, many people say that he was, and some very perfect people have made very strong statements, tremendously beautifully, that Barack Obama was there, but nobody really knows, but maybe some people do. Some very, very strong people feel they do, but maybe they don't. Who knows, right? So it's a way of capturing the citizenry by this sort of tentacle the citizenry understandably has of not wanting to be duped, but then converting this desire not to be duped into giving up on the very idea of truth altogether. 4. Does she oppose hyper-identity politics, which is a 5-step thing that I won't define now? And if so, is her position constructive, or is it part of an authoritarian counter-revolutionary backlash against hyper-identity politics that is worse than the problem it seeks to address? Now, without defining this 5-step hyper-identity politics, let me just say that it's a form of depoliticization in my assessment, a process where, as the world burns, we focus on instructing fellow citizens in ideological purity, all while drifting further away from the political realities of creating meaningful change. And against this, so this is a real problem, but then against it, there has formed a destructive counter-revolutionary wave, which you're seeing very much online. For an online intellectual example, you can just look at Jordan Peterson, but you're also seeing it in politics, right? A good example might be Ron DeSantis. So Ron DeSantis is not simply non-woke. Ron DeSantis is a guy who perpetuates an authoritarian, anti-democratic wave as a response to the problems with wokeism, which is worse than the very thing he's trying to solve and less acceptable to us. And we're in this painful situation where we've got this unconstructive excess of identity politics, and then 90% of the cultural response to it is a disastrous form of authoritarian populism that doesn't solve the problem, doesn't elevate the people who hyper-identity politics tries to elevate but does so unconstructively. We need to have these same people elevated constructively, but instead this authoritarian counterwave comes along that deprioritizes these people instead of elevating them, all the minorities that experience disadvantage, and then attacks our democratic checks and balances. 6, can she manage the issue-specific? Now, let's do 5 first. How does she address the 4 feelings of distrust that citizens feel? Is she exploiting these feelings, or is she engaging with them constructively? So that's feeling, least importantly, unsafe, because your government is incompetent in your perception, feeling powerless because you can't inflect the political process, feeling betrayed because you think that your enemies are being prioritized, your enemies within, right? Trump's lingo are being prioritized within your political system. Or worst of all, this feeling of opacity where politics no longer makes sense. Is she exploiting these for power acquisition, or is she softening the tensions of these forms of distrust and offering something liberatory there? And 6, can she manage the issue-specific crisis of trust without exploitation? So citizens have lost trust in technocratic language. We've just talked about that. They've lost trust in free markets and globalization. And they've lost trust in the ability of politicians to connect with the preponderant values and concerns of either majorities or perceived majorities. And a classic issue here is immigration. In many Western countries, the population is extremely vulnerable to populist authoritarian right exploitation of the immigration issue because they're out of touch with what centrism has to offer. Center-right politics and center-left politics. And this is this perennial challenge of how do you balance, among other things, the fact that often for economic reasons you need to increase net migration to get a workforce that you otherwise can't get into your economy. But on the other hand, you have a toxically dangerous, escalating feeling of people feeling that their borders are not under control. And as a result, they're giving up on politics altogether. It's a very dangerous equation where whatever you do, you lose. And virtually nobody's being both responsible and constructive here when it comes to major political forces in most Western democracies. Beautiful community, I had to take a health break. This is why this video is coming out so late. But let's finish this in 5 to 7 minutes. A bit about British politics and a bit about Kemi Badenoch in a way that speaks to wherever we might be in the world. I'll just go off the cuff here. There is a simmering legitimacy crisis, which you might recognize in your country too, in British politics. The population, a small minority or a big majority of the population, feel that the mainstream political representatives aren't speaking to them. And secondly, that they are dysfunctional, that in the British case, they're unable to reform the dysfunctionality of the British state. For instance, its incapacity to do anything about failing public services and utilities. The responses offered are 2 recently from the Tory party and 1 from the Labour Party. The Labour Party is the party of government with a huge majority but limited national support because of the way our electoral system works. And they're offering a kind of technocratic centrism whose very presence incrementally degrades trust, combined with austerity light on economics, combined with, on social issues, a genuinely progressive values position, mixed with a fake progressive values position that borrows from hyper-identity politics. The solutions of the Tory parties have been a bit worse and much worse recently. The a bit worse was the Rishi Sunak period, which is a form of technocratic centrism too, but with much less responsible individual political actors running it. Most of the people in the Labour Party, whatever you think of them, they're quite individually decent. Lots more chances in the Tory party, and a twang of entrepreneurialism-driven populist right discourse. And that's the slightly worse offer. But the much worse off is the rampaging post-truth authoritarian populism of Johnson or, to a degree, Truss. So some of these three, 2 Tory and 1 Labour solution, are worse than the others, but none of them centrally address the challenges the country faces. The Liberal Democratic Party has opted out of national politics. The Green Party talks about what they would do if they were in power. Instead, the Greens need to focus more on being a workshop that compels more responsible political action from the main parties toward the climate crisis. And the only party that effectively speaks to a significant segment of the population, though it's a smaller minority than that large minority we've just spoken about, is the Reform Party. But they're a party of irresponsible, destructive post-truth politics. So that's a reflection on how things are in many of the countries that we're all from, right? That the political party that speaks most to the population is among the most destructive political parties. It's not impossible that this is the last Labour government in British history. It's unlikely that that's the case, but it's worth mentioning that as not an impossibility, right? This is a plausible chance there, which shows the depth of the collapse of centrism, and much the same, perhaps to a slightly lesser extent, can be said about the Tories, right? So we're talking about a catastrophic implosion of the centre across the West. Now, a couple of words about Kemi Badenoch. The key point I want you to take away is that without saying anything yet about how responsible or destructive she is as a political actor, she is a very instructive political actor, because the qualities she has will reappear over and over and over and over in politicians later in the 20s and in the 2030s. They'll appear very frequently in destructive politicians, but they will also need to partly be borrowed by constructive politicians if they are to succeed, which would require from them to some extent threading that needle, whereby you combine constitutionalism with some populist discourse. So she is hugely instructive, so watch her. She is the future of politics. I don't mean this in a good sense or a bad sense. I mean this just in the terms of historical tendency. But what about the good or the bad sense? Where's she land? I won't rate her according to the 6 questions, because that'll take too long and we partly need to see what happens. But let me say a few words about her. She's not a post-truth populist. She is pro-institutional at the level of at least never radically questioning checks and balances, and often defending them. But she is currently categorizable as a political entrepreneur who is rapid, effective, sometimes reckless at riding moment in culture wars. She borrows a lot and knows a lot about US populist right discourse. She is feisty, clear, spoken, able to speak in direct, everyday terms that cut through the way the discourse of technocrats doesn't. And she may present a problem to the Prime Minister Keir Starmer because of these qualities and because of how good she is at bringing attention to herself and being online and reading what the temperature is online and maneuvering very successfully across moments of cultural moment. But she'll present a problem to him because he may struggle to respond with his legalistic, square, smart, decent, but out-of-touch technocratic discourse. But she could also implode quite quickly through recklessness in that entrepreneurial surfing of moments of political moment. At the level of some of the challenges the country faces, I think she's strong on sensing what the problems are. But when it comes to a solution, I would categorize for now her discourse as primarily in the political entrepreneur box. You do have to give young politicians a break. At the same time, while some politicians become more responsible as they approach power, greater power, the tendencies at most become less responsible, and we have to be realistic about that. But that doesn't change the fact that she is an historically interesting example to follow, because in a certain sense, and maybe this is more of a bad than a good thing, the future is with her. Lots of love.